Hello, everyone. Today, I'd like to talk about privatization, but more particularly about the difficulty of implementing the idea of privatization in a tightly controlled and regulated system. Now, fair warning here, this video is going to be relatively simple. Most of my regular viewers, I imagine, will already know most of this stuff. But this video is going to be the first, I hope, of a larger, semi-regular series in which I'll be giving a basic overview of various problems with capitalist economies. So I think it's best if we start off with some simpler concepts with clear real-world examples we can point to. So we're going to be talking about privatization and nationalization today. And so we should explain what those are. And very quickly here, to privatize a national system means to take a system that is owned and operated nationally and transfer that ownership and operation to private organizations. Organ to church to Paris to order to And nationalization is, of course, the reverse of that, to bring privately owned and operated services under state control. And so what are the benefits of privatizing a service? Well, the on-paper best-case scenario pitch for privatization is as follows. Nationalized services are bloated and slow. The lack of competition means that there's no direct incentive to cut costs or deliver better services, since they have a monopoly. Privatized services, on the other hand, have a need to compete and therefore will offer the best service they can at the best price they can in order to maintain their share of the market. Privatization drives down operating costs and results in a blossoming of innovation and healthy profit-driven competition. That's what they say, anyway. This ideal runs into not insignificant problems when being brought into reality, however. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, I could just list all of the negative results of the privatization of British Rail right here, but that wouldn't be enough, really. We'll get to those later on. For now, with an eye towards the benefits of privatization that I just mentioned, how would you go about privatizing a rail network? So first off, let's think about the trains themselves. It's a good place to start as any, I suppose. The trains in the UK are not owned by the companies that run the trains, you might be surprised to hear. They are owned by what are called rolling stock companies, and these companies lease the trains to the train operating companies. And what's the problem with that, you might be thinking? That's just yet another wonderful level of free market choice. If the operating companies have different competing leasing companies vying to be the ones to lease the trains to them, that'll drive down costs and increase innovation and all the other things that are so great about privatization in theory, right? Well, it's a nice idea, but only that, unfortunately. The main problem here is that certain trains only work on certain parts of the rail network. There's no point in leasing high-speed trains if you only operate a small part of the network where those trains could never get up to full speed. If you own a high-speed track, there's no point running slow trains down it as they'll all block the whole system. There's no point leasing big freight trains if you operate a passenger line. Certain electric trains use a faired rail. Others use overhead power lines. And obviously, you don't want to be leasing electric trains if your company operates an unelectrified section of track. And even the various faired rail and overhead lines in the country have different power configurations. All this means that the train operating companies don't really have much of a choice. It would be pointless for them to lease trains that do not work on the sections of track that they control. You know, they pretty much have to lease the one type of train that they can use on their tracks. So, welcome to the free markets. But, by the way, you're only able to buy one specific thing. Next up, let's consider the tracks. So how would you go about running competing services on a freshly privatized rail network? Now, I don't like to do this, but I'm gonna make an assumption here. I'm going to assume that everyone watching this, even the most libertarian-minded among us, understand why running competing train services down the same tracks with no oversight would be a bad idea. And I'll probably include some footage of trains running into each other here, just to make the point a little more emphatically. But yes, trains are big, heavy metal objects that carry soft, squishy, unsecured humans around very fast. You can just have some company decide to start operating a train between 2 points and slip one onto the rail network. You know. So, how do we get around this problem? Well, the system in place in the book is that various train operating companies bid to operate services on certain routes. And then, once that service has been claimed for a certain period, the operating company runs it exclusively. Now, the big problem with this method of running things is that it makes local competition virtually impossible. And since competition is supposed to be a main feature of this free market privatization thing, that's kind of a major bug there. But what about innovation? That's supposed to be the other main feature, of course. The profit motive will drive innovation. The private companies will take one look at all the inherent problems in running a privatized rail network, and they'll just innovate their way around it. You know, these Randian supermen will find whole new ways to operate rail lines, ways impossible to think of in a sluggish, lazy, nationalized system. Now, the big problem here, if you can call it a problem, is regulation. The rail network is very heavily regulated. The railway rulebook is thick with mandates and controls, and for a very good reason. Without them, lots of people die. You know, this isn't mere red tape. Anyone thinking about getting into the train operating game will have to comply with these rules exactly. So what's the result here? Well, we have a system where operating companies are locked into providing a very specific service in a specific area for a specific time with no possibility for local competition or innovation. We've created a local monopoly here. A series of local monopolies, in fact, which, besides being counter to the free market ideas behind the privatization in the first place, create a few other wider problems as well. So let's talk about those. First of all, slow down. Now, slow down. I hear you cry in shock. I thought it was the bloated, nationalized system with no profit motive to cut costs and times that was subject to slow down. You know, instead of making money, they only had the weak, pathetic motive of operating a good service that benefits society. And well, regardless of the validity of that sentiment, when talking about railways specifically, the privatized system is no better. And I'll throw you a couple of scenarios for you a couple of you. See reality throw you. Ah, Let's say a country with a nationalized rail service funded by taxes needs to make some change to the system. To make This can be in terms of maintenance, replacing and upgrading tracks, closing or moving stations, implementing new regulations, whatever. Now, since the system is controlled by the government, they can relatively simply just go ahead and make the changes. In a privatized system, however, making changes is much more complex. Because of the fragmented nature of the privatized network, implementing a change means the government interfacing with potentially dozens of different private companies, all responsible for different parts of the system, and all motivated not by making the process go smoothly or quickly, but by profit. This unnecessary level of complexity makes what should be relatively simple changes cost far more and run for far longer than they need to. And this problem doesn't stop with the railways either. Trains are just one part of a national transport system, and they factor into decisions made regarding airports, cars, buses, and so on. A new track construction between two cities could affect the road network, for instance. New train stops need to be integrated with bus and tram systems. When deciding upon long-term developments and allocating funds for them, all these different systems need to be considered together. Cost and overruns in the rail network ripple out and affect the transport network at large. So it's not looking too good there for our hypothetical rail network. But let's turn now to our real-world example, British Rail. What have been the effects of the British government privatizing British Rail? Well, firstly, as it stands, the UX rail network is incredibly expensive. Rail. This is This is both on the consumer end, where we subjected to constantly increasing fare rises. A book I read while writing this video called The Transport Debate by Shaun and Iain Docherty notes that a Glasgow to Edinburgh season ticket costs as much as buying an equivalent pass in Germany for the entire rail network. But this costliness is also on the state end, where we now spend much more money subsidizing the private rail network than it ever cost to run British Rail in its entirety. Which is pretty amazing, isn't it? You know, all this free market competition was supposed to drive down costs, and instead we have rising fares and subsidies. The transport debate also notes that it's ever telling that our method of privatizing our rail network has not been adopted by any other EU country that studied it. You know, as you do imagine, it would be if it led to a better service or decreased costs. Now, a big part of the current cost to the taxpayer is the budget for Network Rail, and I should briefly explain just what Network Rail is. After the UK rail system was privatized, the infrastructure of Britain's railways, that is the tracks, the signalling system, tunnels, bridges and all that, it was all owned by Railtrack, which was a group of private companies created to oversee and maintain the rail infrastructure. I'm talking about Railtrack in the past tense here because, to make a long story short, they were rubbish at their jobs and they kept crashing the trains. Maintaining a rail network is a difficult and expensive undertaking, and Railtrack failed spectacularly, most publicly in the wake of the Hatfield rail crash on 17th of October of the year 2000, which killed 4 people and injured more than 70. The subsequent nationwide speed restrictions, safety inspections, rail replacements, not to mention the over £700 million bill for the costs and compensation associated with the Hatfield crash was the end of Railtrack, and it was replaced by Network Rail. Now, Network Rail is a nationalized company owned by the government, responsible for doing all the jobs that Railtrack was rubbish at. So, less than a decade after handing over the reins of railway management to private companies, the British government had to take them back in shame. The British taxpayer now pays through government subsidies to maintain the system on which the private companies run overpriced trains, all for their own profit. It's a pretty good swindle they have going on, to be honest. And perhaps the most shameful aspect to all this is that several of these companies running overpriced British trains in the UK are foreign state-owned train companies. For example, the trains that I regularly take from the station near my house are ran by Mersey Rail, which is a company owned by Dutch state-owned rail transport company Netherlands Spoorwegen. Yikes, it butchered that. Elsewhere, Arava trains are owned by German Deutsche Bahn. The French own a large part of Southern Rail. Southwestern Railway is partly owned by the Imtra Corporation, also known as Hong Kong Railway Corporation Limited. There's no prizes for guessing where they reef from. Under this system, millions of pounds are flowing out of our country via these foreign companies, understandably exploiting our totally ridiculous decision to privatize the rail network. So I have a question. The problems with privatization seem obvious. Railways are inherently uncompetitive, and there is no way to prevent local monopolies forming. So why was the system privatized in the first place? Now, I could just say money here and end the video. That would be pretty funny. But it's a little deeper than that, actually. The privatization of British Rail was just one part of an ideological push towards an idea of free market individualism, typical of the era of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. Which is why she got on Jen's wonderful thumbnail for this video, even though British Rail was actually privatized a few years later under John Major. It was privatization as ideology. Whether the changes actually made sense to implement or not didn't really matter. The individual is everything, and society as ever Well, society doesn't even exist, actually. Margaret Thatcher once said, "There is no such thing as society. There are individual men and women, and there are families." Now, the problem with this line of thinking, obviously, is that it's a load of old shit. But it's not hard to see why people who think like that would be against public transportation and instead favor heavily the car. Yeah, which is very individualistic indeed. So that's my relatively obvious conclusion there. Privatizing the rail network was an ideologically driven attempt to enforce market conditions where they cannot exist. I am hesitant to lay the blame at any one individual's feet, however, though there is a lot of blame to go around, you know. The Conservatives deserve blame for actually, doing it. New Labour deserve blame for not undoing it. The rolling stock and train operating companies deserve their share of the blame as well. But there exists a larger problem than any one greedy CEO or corrupt politician, and it's a systemic problem. I've mentioned the profit motive a few times today, and that will probably factor into my next video in this vein. The need for private companies to profit and grow, and the need for the whole capitalist system to grow in turn, that deserves a closer look. Because as you run out of growth elsewhere, the privatization of public services starts to look more and more viable. So tune in next time where we'll be talking about capitalism's growth problem. Thanks a lot for watching, everyone, and thanks for listening to me waffle about trains for a while. Another possible route for continuing the line of thought in this video, apart from talking about profit and growth, is to talk about the current state of things, this universal healthcare provider, which the current government is not so sneakily attempting to privatize, one slice at a time. So let me know what you think there. If you want more videos like this, shorter, more politics-oriented videos, let me know. Thanks as always to me supporters over on Patreon, who are all very nice. Look at all those amazing names there. So hop over and check out me Patreon if you like. Also, you can send me a question on Curious Cat, or you could follow me on Twitter and retweet everything I ever say. That's it from me today, folks. See you next time.